John 3:30 tells us, he must increase, but I must decrease. This point of reference, if you will, is central to how we look at the numbers with regard to miracles in today's lesson. We are continuing our discussion surrounding the loaves and fishes that we talked about last week, miracles that Jesus did. And we are stealing some from our friend Winky Pratney with some of this lesson as well. I was looking at Winky's free lesson or free sermon of the month at winkypratney.com, and he was discussing some of these verses, and it was kind of some of what he was talking about was what God had been talking to me about, and so I stole a little bit of stuff from him, if you will, his teaching. If you want to go there and watch the whole series or the whole message, you can. It's not about miracles per se; it's about something else, but references these scriptures. Anyway, last week we were in Mark, but we were talking about a series of events that we find duplicated here in Matthew 14, where John the Baptist is beheaded. And where we were in last week's study was right after that, when Jesus feeds the 5,000. And, he gives the disciples kind of a hard time because they want to send him away. Hey, send these people away. We don't have a way to feed them. And he says, see what you've got to have here. And, they're worried about, how much do we buy with money and stuff. He tells them to go see what they have. They come back with 5 loaves, 2 fishes, and he blesses that, feeds the 5,000. They take up 12 baskets of fragments, and then he sends them on across the sea, and he goes up to the mountain to worship and pray. Afterwards, he's walking on the water, and they freak out. He has a little discussion with them, talks to them again about the bread issues, if you will, and then gets to the other side, and people recognize that he's there and who he is, and they bring the sick to him, and they're healed. And that's kind of where we left off last week. And, of course, we were looking at, some specific points with regards to go and see and looking inside ourselves and kind of what Jesus was talking about there. And I want to continue that vein a little bit as we begin to look at chapter 15 in Matthew. And chapter 15 in Matthew, the scribes and Pharisees came to Jesus saying, your disciples are transgressing the law because they're not following tradition with hand washing as they're eating and all this stuff. And Jesus tells them in verse 10, when he called the multitude to himself, he said to them, hear and understand, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. And his disciples came and said, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? But he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind leads the blind, both are going to fall into the ditch. Then Peter answered and said unto him, explain this to us. And Jesus said, are you still without understanding? Do you not understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart. And they defile a man. For out of the heart proceedeth evil thoughts, murders, adultery, fornications, theft, false witness, blasphemies. Excuse me, I'm going to get some water. These are the things that defile a man. It is spring allergy season for me. So, these are the things that defile a man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So, again, it's out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. And so a Gentile woman, in verse 21, verse 22, comes to him. And she says, have mercy on me, O Lord, son of David, my daughter is severely demon-possessed." He didn't say anything to her. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she cries out after us." I know what it is. They're always trying to send people away. And Jesus is always trying to get them to examine what's in their heart. And so he answered and said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the home of Israel." And we've been talking about part of the atmosphere for miracles is that focus on the relationship to finding the lost and bringing them in. It says, "Then she came and worshipped him, saying, 'Lord, help me.' And he answered and said, 'It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the puppies.' And she said, 'Yes, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their masters' tables.'" Verse 28, "Then Jesus answered and said to her, 'O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire.' And her daughter was healed from that very hour." Now, let's look at what happened here. She came crying out, and it says he didn't answer a word. The disciples say, "Send her away." In other words, there's a need. We don't know how to meet it. Send it away. And he says, it's about restoring relationship, etc. And at that point, she comes and worships him, recognizing he's the source, and says, "Lord, help me." And then he goes into this bread analogy. Bread is all over these chapters here. And we talked about the table of showbread last week in relationship, meeting God face to face. Here, he says it's not good to take the young ones, the immature, their bread and throw it to the dogs. It says little dogs in my translation here, which is the New King James. It could literally be the puppies. And she gets it, right? She says, "Yes, Lord, but even the little dogs can eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." In other words, they don't need the whole loaf. They just need some of the bread. And he is, of course, the bread of life. She's saying, even the crumbs. And, we tend to look at that as like a beggar's thing, but she's stating a fact that there's something, and it's sufficient. Even the crumbs are sufficient. It's not that they're just the insufficient, but they're the sufficiency. And so Jesus answers at this point, "Great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Great is your faith. What is her great faith? Is that she recognizes that even the crumb is a sufficiency. When you're talking to existence, when you're talking to the source, when you're talking to the miracle of God, even a little is enough. And more than enough, it's plenty. I do apologize for my voice today, but this is oaks bloom and this happens. So, now, it says in verse 29, Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, blind, mute, maimed, and many others, and they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. And he healed them. So the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. He did another miracle, mass healing going on. And let's look at what the healing is that's going on. It's the lame is able to walk, the mute able to speak. In other words, whatever their need is, it's being met. It's being sufficient. We talked last week about when the 5,000 were fed, it said, and they were all filled. In other words, they all got an abundance to the point of, completely filled, leveled off. They didn't need anymore. They didn't, it wasn't like, well, you get a little piece of fish and a little piece of bread and you'll still be hungry, but at least you'll survive. It wasn't like that. It was they got whatever they needed. And here, as he's healing these people, they got whatever they needed. It's not that the lame was able to speak and the lame was able to see and the lame was able to hear and the lame was no, it was what each person needed. The lame was able to walk, the blind was able to see, the mute was able to speak. That's what we're talking about here. And it says, and they glorified the God of Israel. Now, let's look at verse 32. Now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude. Remember this word compassion. We've talked about that in the previous weeks. I have compassion on the multitude because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. So he's kind of laid out the argument the disciples have had. Send them away. And he's like, I don't want to send them away. I'm just telling you right now, because I don't want them to faint on the way. So let's look at verse 33. His disciples answered and said to him, where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a great multitude? Hello? Have you been with me in the other chapters? Have you walked through this before? Are you kidding? Is this a real question you're asking? At least that's where I would be. Verse 34. Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? He didn't have to say, go see this time. They got that part. Oh, he's going to ask us about loaves and stuff again. Where is your faith, right? That's what you got to be thinking. And they said 7 and a few little fish. So they had 7 loaves and a few fish. Few would be 2 or more. So before they had 5 and 2, now they got 7 and 3, 4, 2.5, whatever. So they've got more than they had before. You just kind of wonder why they didn't just start there. God, we have 7 loaves and a few fish. Can you feed these people with this? And how many people did he feed last time? 5,000. How many this time? Well, we're going to find out it's 4,000 in just a minute. And so he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and the fish and gave thanks and broke them and gave to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. This is exactly like the previous story. And it says, so they all ate and were filled. Again, they all ate and they were filled. They got what they needed. They all ate and got what they were in need of. Their need was met. To filled, that's abundance. And he says, let's see. So they ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets full of the fragments that were left. Now those who ate were 4,000 men besides women and children. And he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala. Okay? Now, I want to look at a couple things here. By the numbers, miracle 1, they had 5 loaves, 2 fishes, fed 5,000, took up 12 baskets. Here, they had 7 loaves, a few fishes, fed 4,000, and took up 7 baskets. So in the first story, they had more people, less raw materials, and took up more leftovers. In the second situation, obviously, they had more stuff, less people, and took up less leftovers. And you say, well, that doesn't make any sense. I can't derive a mathematical equation from that. You know, I like math. I know it probably makes me weird, but I like math. Math is pretty straightforward. 2 plus 2 equals 4. It's not like English where I comes before E except after C and whenever else we decide to change the rules. Math is 2 plus 2 equals 4. And so if we say I have 5 loaves, 2 fishes, 5,000 people take up 12 baskets, then if I've got 4,000 people, I shouldn't need 5 loaves and 2 fishes. I should be able to do it somehow with less. But no, I got more. I got 7 loaves and more fishes. And I feed those and I only take up 7 baskets full, which is like almost half left over what I had before. And I started with more and had less people. That makes no sense. The math doesn't work. And that's why we need to look at this a little bit. What's true is that all were filled. All were filled in the first instance. All were filled in the second instance. All were filled. The spoils, if you will, the leftovers that they took up, in both cases are an abundance of what they had need of. An abundance of the most they could need, because everybody was filled. You know, you've been there, right? Thanksgiving dinner, you're filled. I couldn't possibly eat another bite. Oh, look, pumpkin pie. And then you feel like you've hurt yourself because you ate too much. They were all filled. And then there was the abundance that was left over. In both cases, there was an abundance. And, other than, I guess, for someone like me to try and make a point regarding the abundance, it doesn't even matter how much was left over. What was left over was way more than what they started with. Or was it? And we're looking at by the numbers, what's the things that we have that are consistent? Well, consistent was everybody had all they could have or all they could want, and there was stuff left over. And in every case, Jesus took it, blessed it, broke it, and handed it out. Jesus was the source, if you will, of the supply. I'm not saying he was the baker, but it was from his hand that they were given what they needed. And in every case, they were filled and there was an abundance. So by the numbers, here's what I need you to understand. When Jesus is our source, our supply and our demand don't matter if he's our source. There will be enough and then some. The greater miracle? Well, the greater miracle obviously would be feeding the 5,000 with less and having more left over. And we could say, well, that's the greater miracle, but it's not. The miracle is Jesus himself. The miracle is existence itself. The miracle is God is our source, and it's recognizing that God is our source that is the key to having what we need. All were filled. The Bible tells us that he uses the foolish thing to confound the wise. See, we can say, well, that's foolishness. It doesn't make sense. There's all, when he healed the blind man and he, spit and rubbed mud in his eye and all that stuff, that's foolishness. And yet, the miracle was real. And there's things that happen. Sometimes people get a little on the foolish side. By the way, there's no miracle power in being foolish. The miracle power comes in being obedient. Sometimes obedient to something that seems foolish to the wisdom of man, but God uses it, and the wise man is confounded by that. That shouldn't even work. It's because you're looking at the logic of how many loaves and fishes and how many people and how much leftovers instead of the source. The source is Jesus Christ. How do I fix a screwed up life? Go to the source Jesus Christ. Get in a relationship with him. Whatever you need, he can supply. You'll be satisfied. And in fact, there will be an abundance. That's the message that we see over and over again. Now, chapter 16, Matthew 16. Verse 1, the Pharisees and Sadducees came testing him and asked him for a sign from heaven. They got to see something. Show us a sign. But they're just trying to catch him up and trip him up. And so I want to look at verse 5, and we'll read a couple verses down here. Verse 5. Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Can you believe this? They had forgotten to take, everything in their life the last several days is bread. And, we forgot bread. And Jesus said to them, take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Beware of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Beware of those that would be religiously right. They have the law down pat. Beware of those that would put the show on themselves. Beware of that. That's the leaven. That's the lack of humility. That's the self-importance. That's all, and he's saying that's not the issue. See, this goes back to what is the source of bread? He's the bread of life. And the disciples reasoned among themselves, saying, It is because we have taken no bread. That's it. That's what it is. He's talking about the fact he knows we didn't bring bread. That's what this is all about. But Jesus, being aware of it, said to them, O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand? I'm going to pause at that comma right there. O ye of little faith, I have done miracles multiple times in your midst in the recent past, taking small amounts of bread and feeding multiples and having more left over when we were done. I have been the source of that miracle. Do you not yet get it? What do you mean you didn't bring any bread? I'm the bread of life. You got the whole thing right here. Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? He's making them do the math. Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up? How is it that you do not understand that I do not speak to you concerning bread? This is a spiritual discussion. You're talking about bread. Wonder bread, maybe. Sourdough, I don't know. He says, but to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. See, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the rule makers, the ones that are it's all about them. The show. Don't get caught up in the leaven of that, the leaven of the pride, the leaven of those things that put the focus in the wrong place. You're focused on how many loaves of bread you have. They're focused on show us something, we can see if we can trip you up on a technicality regarding the law. He's saying, I'm the bread of life. Don't you understand? I'm the source of the miracle. I'm the source of what's needed. I'm able to give in abundance. And you're counting loaves. You've let the rightness of the Sadducees and Pharisees and the show and all that stuff, you've let that become what you're focused on instead of the bread of life. And so, what we need to look at is the importance of me. we want to see miracles and we want to create an atmosphere for miracles, we need to look at the importance of me. What is the role of me in the miracle? I have news for you. The importance of me is that I'm obedient. That's it. It's not how tall I am. It's not how smart I am. It's really about my heart attitude and being obedient, my obedient heart attitude. Now, we've talked about prayer and how important that is. But see, an obedient heart is in prayer. An obedient heart has an attitude of prayer. And I'm not trying to create a big guilt trip here for anybody. I'm really focused on, this whole series is focused on the idea of an atmosphere, creating an atmosphere for miracles, because I believe God wants to do miracles in our midst. And so the atmosphere for miracles, putting prayer, making it a habit, having faith in God, leading people to God, right relationship, recognizing that God is the source, that it's not about how I stand or whether I put the right emphasis when I'm speaking, or it's being obedient to what God's telling me to do, even if it seems foolish. But it won't be foolish if I'm doing what God told me to do. It might look foolish to man. God doesn't step out of his word. He is the word. So whatever he asks you to do is going to line up with his word. That's why it's important we know his word. That's a great check for you right there. Is this in line with God's word? Then I shouldn't do it. If it's in line with his word, I should do it. Knowing his voice, my sheep know my voice. How do I create the right atmosphere? That's it. It's my heart attitude before God. It's having the ability to be obedient and it being a right relationship with God, being in communication with God. That's how I create the right atmosphere. So I'm not trying to guilt anybody today. What I'm saying is we need to recognize he is the source of all of these things that happen. He's the source of whatever we need. His direction is going to be appropriate for whatever we need. And when God speaks to you, be obedient and you'll see the miracle. The enemy will try and convince you it's, the pizza you ate last night or whatever. When God speaks to you, be obedient to what he's speaking. Check it against his word. Check it in your heart. Be obedient. Let God do the miracle. He's a miracle working God. I've seen miracles many, 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 many times in my life. They're born out of prayer. They're born out of right relationship with him. So this morning, as we kind of wrap up this lesson, I would just ask you to just take a moment, examine your heart and say, God, I need to recognize that you're the source, and stop looking at how many loaves there are or how many needs there are or whether or not there's going to be a sufficient abundance, and recognize that as long as I come to you, whatever need there is will be met to abundance, to its completeness, and there'll even be an overflow if I simply look to you as the source. I confess, God, that I have sinned against you by doubting that simple equation, doubting the math of plus God equals enough. There's a song that says, God and I make a majority. And that's really the right attitude, because God's more than enough. Whatever you have, it's more than enough if God is the source of your miracle. So, make God the source. Confess your lack of faith in that. And get ready to see some miracles. It's coming. God's going to move in a mighty way. Let's create that atmosphere for miracles. And that's it for this week.